Thanks, Rebecca. Well, the heartbeat of our democracy is voting. And as the insurrection this week in our nation's capital showed, attempts to thwart citizens' votes and the will of voters is an ever-present danger. John Gordon will talk about this, about where we've been, where we're going with the continuing work against voter suppression. John was with Faegre and Benson, Faegre Bakers Daniel, for many years, and served as an adjunct professor of law at the University of Minnesota and St. Thomas. Welcome, John, and thanks for joining us. Go ahead.
Thank you, Catherine. This is a great delight to be here. I can't tell you how happy I am and surprised to see that despite the fact there are a number of people on this call whom I know and admire, they're still logged on. So I'm very grateful for that, and delighted that we can get together and talk about so much to talk about. It's really an embarrassment of riches, meaning an embarrassment of catastrophes that we've got to deal with. And so I'm going to do a hop, skip, and a jump through some of these issues, and then we'll have time at the end for questions and discussion. So let me get us started here with the announced topic of the conversation, which is voter suppression. And I've actually had cause, as I think we all have, to think more broadly about that concept in the last few days. So it sounds pretty highfalutin to say that the right to vote freely is a cornerstone of our democracy, because it's one of those things that we take for granted. And it's a great luxury to take it for granted, a great privilege, if you want to use that terminology, to take it for granted, as many of us do. But it is under attack now. It has been under attack. And as far as I can tell, it's always going to be under attack. This week, we have really been eyewitnesses to history. On a day where we should have been marveling at democracy at work in Georgia and a hard-won transition of power, we instead watched as Washington, D.C. erupted into chaos and violence. And this violence, despite the somewhat casual, I think, attitude of some of the rioters, strikes directly at our core values as a constitutional democracy. So, like all of you, I was literally transfixed and terrified by the rioting and insurrection at our nation's capital. A seditious mob, and that I think is the most descriptive term, a mob set on sedition, mostly white rioters violently desecrated the headquarters of our nation's democracy and successfully, if temporarily, brought the machinery of our democracy to a halt, which was exactly their intention. White supremacy clearly fueled this mob's attempts to overturn and silence the will of the people. And in addition to the photographs that I've included in this presentation, there was another one of a noose that I thought, frankly, was a bridge too far, and I have decided not to include it. But let there be no mistake, if there ever could have been, that that's exactly what was going on. These people were incited by President Trump, a corrupt grifter who was intent on stalling and interfering with the very operation of the very government that he is supposed to be protecting, and really encouraging people to attack this, not just the symbol of our democratic institutions, but the very idea that we are capable of governing ourselves. So if that's not voter suppression, the term really doesn't have any meaning. To be clear, these were not protests. We at the ACLU know protests. What we witnessed on Wednesday was a failed coup attempt, an insurrection against a duly elected government. There's been some chatter, and a lot of weird chatter in a lot of media about, oh, it wasn't really a coup because these people weren't trying to take over the machinery of government. They were clearly acting at the behest of somebody who was trying to take over the machinery of government after January 20, when he will no longer be entitled to do so. So what we saw are violent acts meant to subvert the peaceful transfer of power and the very hallmark of our democracy. Now, to make matters worse, law enforcement was lenient and at times even deferential to this mob, which was really a shocking contrast to the paramilitary response that greeted protests and actions in the street this summer to try to protest legitimately overreaching of government and overreaching of policing. So this has been said before, but I think it deserves some comment and some emphasis. If you look at the way that Black and brown people were treated in the streets this summer, and you look at the way that these folks were treated inside the Capitol through a lack of preparedness to some extent, but I think you all have also seen what I've seen, which is cops opening up the gates to let people in. One cop is helping a rioter down the street down the stairs when he was afraid she was going to lose her footing. I mean, it was a whole combination of things. So we can debate, was it lack of preparedness? Was it this? Was it that? It was a whole combination of things. But I will just say this, and I feel very strongly about it. If this had been a mostly Black and brown crowd, this would have been real different. These folks were within seconds of taking over the Senate and other parts of the government. And this is what stopped them from taking over the House of Representatives. They got that far. And so the fact that it didn't succeed doesn't change the core fact that members of Congress who wanted to set aside the Electoral College slate and agitators and rioters who stormed the Capitol were both involved in a failed coup attempt. Here's, I think, a particularly dramatic photo that came out, and it's gotten some play. But you'll notice that there are two portraits partially visible in this photograph. I've done a little looking into this, and there is some uncertainty, but it appears that one of the photos is of Justin Morrill, whom I think you have all heard of because of his name is on the land grant legislation that established the University of Minnesota and a lot of other land grant universities all across the country, a prominent abolitionist after whom Morrill Hall is named at the University of Minnesota. And there are Morrill Halls at state and land grant universities all over the country. The other portrait appears to be of Charles Sumner, who is the representative from Massachusetts, the abolitionist representative from Massachusetts, who was attacked in 1856 on the floor of the House of Representatives by Representative Preston Brooks of South Carolina, and had I will say this, I say this to a church group, had the crap beat out of him, and was 3 years before he could set foot back on the floor of the House of Representatives, which he ultimately did. So that's the context that flag was being shown inside the United States Capitol. And then this is a photograph I know you've all seen. What I didn't see right away is that this guy, who I will say has subsequently been arrested, as has the guy in the Viking costume, by the way, left Nancy Pelosi a note on her desk with a bunch of obscenities in it that I won't repeat. But it says, "We will not back down," echoing Trump's statement earlier in the week that we will never concede. But you know what? At the ACLU and with all of you as allies, we are not going to back down either. And let me take a few minutes now to prove that to you and to prove to you what we're doing here. These are the 6 types of voter suppression, in addition to rioting in the Capitol, that I want to talk about. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on each one of them, but these are the kinds of things that we at the ACLU have been fighting about, both here in Minnesota and nationally. As I think a lot of you know, the ACLU of Minnesota is an affiliate of the national organization, the ACLU. And so we have our own boards of directors, we have our own financial statements, we've got our own bank accounts, we've got our own agendas, but we work in concert with the national organization, and we get an enormous amount of support from them and they from us, because we're the boots on the ground in Minnesota, just as there is an affiliate in every state, and more than every state, as I will get to at the end of this presentation. So, the first method of voter suppression is imposing expense and inconvenience on people. Here's what we're trying to do about that in the state of Minnesota. In light of the COVID virus, we sued the Minnesota Secretary of State, and he ultimately agreed to mail absentee ballot applications to every voter in the state, rather than make people request them specifically. To be clear, these were not ballots; these were ballot applications, and obviously that's a big difference. It has been a crime in Minnesota for the same person to help more than 3 voters fill out their ballots, or for a candidate to help voters. We sued to invalidate those limitations, those types of voter suppression, and we won. The case is called Dital versus Simon. Let me point out one thing in passing. We have an excellent, in my view, Secretary of State in the state of Minnesota named Steve Simon. That doesn't prevent him from getting sued every time we've got an issue with the laws and the way that the laws get, the way that the laws have to be enforced, as long as they are enforced. And so oops, I did something wrong here. Just a minute. Can anyone tell me, am I back? Can any of the...
You're back.
Okay, my apologies for that. I got excited and hit the keyboard when I didn't mean to. So the fact that Steve Simon ends up as a defendant on all these cases is not an indication that he's doing a bad job or doing something wrong, but he's the one you got to sue when you're making these challenges. And then finally in Minnesota, we got rid of the witness requirement on absentee ballots, especially in an era of COVID when people aren't supposed to be near each other. It was really wrong to require that somebody be present as a witness when you mail in an absentee ballot. So we got rid of that, and we're very proud of that. So the second form of voter suppression that's worth a mention is voter ID laws. Now, we've successfully eliminated that in the state of Minnesota, but when you look at the national landscape, this is what you see: 34 states with voter ID requirements, and of those, 7 requiring a very, very narrow list of government photo IDs, which is a talking point for people who don't want folks to vote. But in point of fact, requiring voter IDs is, as I've said, a solution in search of a problem. Of the billion or so votes cast in the first 14 years of this decade, and that's as recent as I've got, 31 instances of voter impersonation. So it is not only using a cannon to kill a housefly, it is harming a lot of people in the process. And who does it harm? It reduces voter turnout overall. It focuses harm on racial minorities and other vulnerable groups. It imposes a poll tax, in effect, because even if government issue ID is free, the documents needed to get one, certified copy of a birth certificate, etc., driver's licenses are not free. And the one thing it doesn't do is prevent fraud. And look at the extent of the problem. 1 out of every 9 citizens has no government issued photo ID. And look at the racial imbalance. 25% of African Americans disqualified by these laws versus 8% of whites. 8%, let me say, is way too much. But look at the imbalance. and then there's the political part of it, where, you know, gun permits are okay, student IDs are not, public assistance IDs are not acceptable in North Carolina. Do you see a pattern here? I do. And then finally, it's particularly hard on transgender voters, many of whom do not have an ID that accurately reflects their gender. So that's the second one. The third one is limitations on early voting and registration. Again, we are in pretty good shape here in Minnesota, but don't think that it's not a problem on a national basis, because it is. There are many states that have no early voting, no absentee voting. Pennsylvania has been particularly restrictive, and here are just some examples of the kind of limitations and the very onerous penalties that get imposed, which are way out of line with other kinds of crimes. I'm busting through this a little bit. I'm violating Ned Wall's rules about how many words you can have on a single PowerPoint slide, but better to ask for forgiveness than permission, as they say. So again, just some other examples in other states of what's been going on in terms of voter suppression. Purging names from voting rolls. Again, not that much of a problem in Minnesota, in part because we have same-day voter registration. But Indiana and Ohio, two examples of states that purge voters' names when they've failed to vote. And then, of course, you run into the problem that you always run into with these things, and that is people with the same names, even people with the same names and birth dates. I mean, that really happens, and it really is a serious problem. Here's what I want to talk about, and this is a Minnesota issue: felony disenfranchisement. In 48 out of 50 states, people with felony convictions are prevented in whole or in part from voting. So these are folks who, for example, after they are released from incarceration, we say to them, okay, go back to your communities, go back to your families, go back, get housing, get a job, get education. And yet we continue to throw not only substantive hurdles in front of them, but badges of separation, badges of not being a part of society. So on the one hand, we're saying be a part of society, but not so much, and certainly not in terms of voting, which is the most basic connection that most of us have with society and with the government, and it's a big problem. More than 5 million Americans cannot vote because of felony convictions. It's huge. In Minnesota, well, let me talk about Florida first before I talk about Minnesota. I mean, it never quits. Florida voters overwhelmingly voted to re-enfranchise over 1 million people who had been in prison for felonies, but then were back in the community. In other words, they voted to change the Florida rule to what it already was and is in the state of Minnesota, which is that you can't vote while you're behind bars. But you can vote after you. In Minnesota today, you cannot vote when you're behind bars, and you cannot vote while you're still on supervised release. Florida was trying to get to at least to that point. The legislature then imposed a requirement that all fines and fees be paid, and did not provide for even letting people know what they were. And in a case called Jones versus Florida, the 11th Circuit, which is the federal circuit that covers everything from Florida and Georgia all the way over to Alabama, said, yeah, that's fine with us. We don't think that's voter suppression. It's wrong. We disagree with it, but that appears to be the law right now. So these felony disenfranchisement laws are all over the place. And here are some examples of the inconsistencies. And I have to call out the states of Maine and Vermont. Those are the two states where every eligible citizen, everybody 18 and over, can vote every day of their lives. As far as I know, the governments of Maine and Vermont have not come crashing down due to their allowing people to do this. And so I really do think that they serve as a great example for all of us. It's particularly true. This is particularly vicious because these felony disenfranchisement laws were basically attempts to prevent Black people from voting. As we know that as the incarceration rate rises, so does the disenfranchised population. And we know that therefore racial disparities in incarceration lead to racial disparities in disenfranchisement. So the more disparities there are in felony convictions and sentences, the more you are preventing people who we claim are members of our community and we don't let them be. We are trying to do something about that in the state of Minnesota. Jennifer Schroeder is a young woman, still fairly young, who as a very young woman was sentenced to 365 days in county jail on a controlled substance conviction, but was also sentenced to 40 years of probation. 40 years. So she never went to prison. She served about a year in a county jail and is now not going to be able to vote under current Minnesota law until she is 71 years old. We think that's a travesty. Since she has been back in society, she has got a family. She's graduated from college. She's now an addiction counselor. And she's our lead plaintiff in a case, again, against Steve Simon, along with three other plaintiffs, including one of our members of the staff of the ACLU of Minnesota, who had been incarcerated for 17 years and is now back. And to say that he is a productive member of society vastly understates it. He's one of our star performers and one of the leaders of our staff at the ACLU of Minnesota. And so we've included him as a plaintiff also in this case. So we didn't do too well in the district court, but the case is on appeal. Obviously didn't get decided in time for the election this year, but we're still working on it. The last form of voter suppression I want to talk about is partisan gerrymandering, which is gerrymandering, as it turns out. I understand that Elbridge Gerry's descendants claim that it's a hard G, but I guess we'll still keep calling it gerrymandering, which is basically including as many people of a particular persuasion or a particular race in some districts and then excluding them from other districts so that you can reduce the Black vote, you can reduce the liberal vote, you can reduce the conservative vote in some states. So Wisconsin has been particularly egregious in this respect. Here's the Wisconsin experience. And you can see it here. Less than half the vote in 2012, but because of gerrymandering, had nearly 2/3 of the seats in the Wisconsin Assembly, and then it got worse in 2014. I confess I don't know what it is today. It's too fast for me to keep track of it. But Wisconsin is the poster child for that. In a case a year and a half ago, the Supreme Court, the United States Supreme Court, said we ain't touching that. Everybody acknowledges that racial gerrymandering is a cause of action that the courts can cure. They've held now that political gerrymandering or partisan gerrymandering is not. So unfortunately, I will say that's the law of the land. But that may not be the end of that story either, for reasons that I will get to in just a minute. So there's good news. There's some good news. Minnesota we are still. I think we should be very proud of our experience here in the state of Minnesota. We again this year were the leading state in terms of voter participation, percentage of voter participation in the election, and I think that's a lot to be proud of. And I think it's due to the mostly good laws that we've got in this state. And again, our excellent Secretary of State, Steve Simon. I'm skipping over this because I want to have time to talk about a few things at the end. So our advocacy at the ACLU is a three-pronged strategy. There is litigation that I've talked about. We do legislative advocacy in all 50 states and in Congress. And then we have a very energetic community engagement project in the state of Minnesota and everywhere else. So speaking to litigation first, in addition to Minnesota, we've had successful litigation in these 12 states that are on this slide. And we are very proud of the people that we have extended the franchise to all over the country. In Minnesota, again, I have violated the wall rule on number of words in a slide, but I had hoped that by putting a picture of cute kids on the slide that I would get some slack, but probably I won't. But in the state of Minnesota, the ACLU and 129 volunteers sent out 37,000 texts, 45,000 phone calls, half to people with felony convictions who were living in the community and half to Black and Latinx voters. 22,000 mailers to former offenders, letting them know that many of them have the right to vote. 9,000 door knocks, cards on 15,000 vehicles, print, digital, and radio ads, posters by local Black, Indigenous, and people of color artists, 41,000 brochures and pocket cards, and then monitoring polling places and participating in election protection hotlines. So sorry for all the numbers, but we're very proud of that work. It was really extensive, and we think it was a great thing for the voters in the state of Minnesota. Where do we go from here? Let me ask that question rhetorically. And I've thought of a few things that should be thought about, I think, and that aren't traditional voter suppression ideas. All of them aren't. But I'd like you all to be at least thinking about some of these things. We've seen this year the electoral process, electoral college process, is not as certain or as stable as it ought to be. I think there are, even without huge change, we can make the system that we've already got a little more clear. I think we can fix our voting infrastructure. We can improve our security. We can impose standards nationally as to what ought to be, what is safe and secure and accurate voting. We can register voters automatically with driver's licenses. There was a proposal in the city of Minneapolis to send a card to every person at the commencement of renting an apartment or a house as to where they would be able to vote in their new home, in their new location. I think it would be very easy to make Election Day a holiday, and you still have to deal with essential workers that don't get it as a holiday, but I think you would increase participation. Even though we are not doing well in the national law, that does not mean that state legislatures can't end gerrymandering in their particular state. The proposal to require voting is, I will acknowledge, a heavy lift, very controversial, and something about which I personally would have to think a little bit further about. But to require or reward voting is something I think that ought to be on the table. I think we've seen what happens when you've got a long transition period. As you know, the transition period between the election and the inauguration has been shortened once from 4 months to 2.5 months. But in these days, perhaps if you shortened it further, you'd have less chance for mischief in between. Eliminating the Electoral College, we know that the Electoral College, based on Senate as well as House of Representatives representation, is favors people in low population states over people in high population states. That is a form of voter suppression. And particularly in the events of this week, the movement for District of Columbia statehood has gotten a shot in the arm. These folks were on the front lines of this. Think about the fact you were thinking about Capitol Police. You were thinking about FBI. You were looking at a lot of these people. You were looking at the people who were sweeping up the Capitol after the mob got through tearing it up. And those folks, many of them, most of them, live in the District of Columbia. They don't get to vote. Their votes have been suppressed. Same with folks who live in Puerto Rico. So I hope that is food for thought. And with that, I would welcome discussion, questions.
There's a number of questions in the Q&A.
Yeah, I haven't seen. Help me. I can't walk and chew gum at the same time. So, Rebecca, yes. I will be grateful for your help in that.
Okay. And also, I apologize. I did not mention this at the start. If people want to ask a question, they can raise their hand and then they can be unmuted. Ann Manning first asked this question. Do you think Trump will pardon those who've been arrested? When will Georgia senators be seated so Schumer takes over the Senate leadership?
Yogi Berra said, predictions are so difficult, especially about the future. And I've lived by that. I think Trump is going to be more focused in on his buddies at the higher levels of government, and I think his hand is going to get tired before he gets to any of those folks. People have seen over and over again that Donald, you've always got a friend in me. Trump turns out not to be there when you need him. And I think that's what you're going to see here too. But that is really a view from the cheap seats.
Okay. And then when are Georgia senators seated? Oh,
I don't know the answer to that.
Okay.
I could keep talking, but
we've got lots of other questions. So Ned Wall actually has several questions, but he first started out by saying, thanks for your great work. First, are there any key pending U.S. Supreme Court cases on voting rights that we need to follow?
The answer to that is there isn't anything pending right now that we've been following. And so there certainly is going to be, and there certainly is going to be a lot of interest in the Supreme Court as the calls increase for Justice Breyer's retirement, because people don't want to, let's say, I think the phrase would be make the RBG mistake again. There's a lot packed into that, including whether it was a mistake or not. But I think that's the thing to keep your eye on in the court.
Okay. Where's Minnesota on requiring payment of fees and fines as a prerequisite to voting?
That is not the law right now, and I'm pretty sure there is action in the legislature on that. And I think we're going to see the answer to that in the next few weeks when the legislature convenes.
Okay. As citizens, what can we do to protect the right to vote in Minnesota?
Well, I think that that the list that I gave is at least a starting point. I think that Election Day should be a holiday. I think that it would be a good idea for the Attorney General to have a specific election protection division, and we have an outstanding Attorney General. And I think that in light of what we've been seeing here recently, I think that's going to be under consideration too. And then, frankly, let me make clear: the ACLU does not support or oppose candidates for elected or appointed office, period. Having said that, I will also say that it would be a good idea to continue to keep a Secretary of State who is focused on voting rights and who is sophisticated in these things and who is devoted to the cause of extending the franchise and protecting the right to vote. I think that's really the most important thing.
Is it clear whether voter suppression always favors one side or the other?
Absolutely not. The 2019 Supreme Court case that I mentioned was actually a pair of cases, one from Wisconsin and one from Maryland. And in the Wisconsin case, this is going to be somewhat of a shorthand. The Republicans were the bad guys, and in the Maryland case, the Democrats were the bad guys. So I do think that the Republican Party has hitched its star to the concept of voter suppression. They have concluded, for example, mail-in ballots. I didn't mention mail-in ballots because it's already a thing in Minnesota. But Trump was all over trying to suppress mail-in ballots, and there were a lot of Republicans that were saying, "Well, wait a minute, it's like, what about the military? What about people who are older? Those are traditional Republican constituencies." And I do think that that when you've got that type of balance, you're gonna see less shenanigans, or is it fewer shenanigans? But when you've got things like where do you have enough polling places in inner city neighborhoods? That is something where the Republicans have been very active in every state that I'm aware of, trying to suppress the vote of people who live in certain geographic areas.
At what level does Minnesota prevent criminals, that's in quotes, criminals, from voting?
So in Minnesota, in Minnesota, you cannot vote while you are in jail for a felony. You can for a misdemeanor, and you can if you're being held pretrial, if you can get your hands on a ballot, which is another problem. Actually, we had a project of trying to get ballot applications to people who were incarcerated but still eligible to vote. So if you are in jail for a felony or in prison for a felony, you cannot vote in Minnesota. If you are still on supervised release, like Jennifer Schroeder is, no matter how long that is, whether it's 1 year, 5 years, or 40 years, you cannot vote in the state of Minnesota. So you have to have completed all of the terms of your supervision or incarceration in Minnesota.
This question is from Peter Eichten. Why couldn't registration be lifetime? Once a person registers to vote, it should be good for the life of the person, no matter where they live.
Got it. I don't know why not. I do. One of the things that goes on is that you have to vote in the precinct where you live. Now, maybe that is a requirement that could be changed, now that I think of it, which I hadn't. But as long as you have to vote in the precinct where you live, you need to figure out where you live, and the government needs to figure out where you live to make sure that you are voting in the right place. Let me be clear. It is not the case that there is never any voter fraud, that there is never any wrongdoing. I don't make that case at all. It is very limited and very rare. But as some right-wing commentator said in the paper this morning, that I noticed it, and this is not a paraphrase, there has been voter fraud ever since the end of time. That doesn't work on a Zoom call, but that was hilarious in case anybody missed it. And so the government is not only just entitled, but really needs to keep track of people and make sure they are voting. But why it is that you particularly need to vote in the right precinct, it makes a difference as to who you can vote for, or at least in the right town. So you'd have to keep track of that. So I think that would be the impediment to a lifelong registration system.
Please, this is from Bill and Ruth Davini. Please address how gerrymandering contaminates our democracy by driving polarization in our political campaigns.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you for that. One of the reasons that there are a lot of reasons why politics are so polarized today, but one of them is that we are basically self-sorting. The number of districts and counties where there is 50-50, 55-45, 60-40 splits between liberals and conservatives is diminishing, and the blue districts and blue counties and blue cities are getting bluer, and red areas are getting redder. What that means is that to be elected and reelected, representatives in particular need to stoke their own base, whether it's on the left or on the right, and they don't need to take more moderate positions. And so the era when Ev Dirksen and Lyndon Johnson used to yell at each other during the day and go out for drinks at night is pretty much over. Everybody hates everybody all the time. And part of the reason for that is that people are self-sorting. Gerrymandering exaggerates that and makes it easier because it allows you to, they call it, it's referred to as packing and cracking. You basically give up a few districts or one district and try to pack as many of the opposition votes in there as you can. Or if there are few enough of them, you're cracking instead of packing, and you're separating folks so they always get outvoted. But what it does is it diminishes the power and the presence of people who aren't in a position to control the process. In the Wisconsin case in the Supreme Court, it was a fascinating record, and it's not surprised. It's like, here we are today. It's all computers. There are these incredible computer programs that will literally draw lines on a map to maximize the power of a particular party. And in Wisconsin, as I say, it was the Republicans that had the control of that. But it is really harmful to moderation, and it's harmful to cooperation.
This is from John Humphrey. Is ACLU Minnesota doing anything to allow or encourage immigrants to vote, undocumented immigrants?
The answer to that is to undocumented immigrants is that only citizens can vote, and so there is not any attempt to do that. And we have an office in Mankato and 3 staff in southern Minnesota that spend a lot of time at community events, communicating with folks, getting to know immigrant communities, particularly, as I say, in southern Minnesota is not where all immigrant communities are, but it's a very large population of immigrant communities in southern Minnesota, and we have been very active in there in know your rights and voting information. So the answer to that is very much so, yes.
Thank you. Sonia Carnes asks, sorry to take us back to our national dilemma. How hopeful are you that the impeachment process could limit DT from running again?
Again, by way of a disclaimer, I happen to know that the executive committee of the board of the National American Civil Liberties Union is meeting now, actually right now, to decide to take a position one way or the other on impeachment. So institutionally, I am still an agnostic on impeachment and its desirability. There really are arguments for and against. I think you all are basically aware of what those are. I'll give you a view again from the cheap seats, and that is those of us who are watching this happen, in my view, kind of, if you'll pardon the double negative, can't not try to do that. It's not okay to do it for a lot of reasons, but it is really not okay not to do it. I mean, this was an attempted, again, I'm going to say this. This was not just a walk in the park. This was an attempt to interfere with the operations of the government of the United States of America. It was sedition. How can you not try to find a remedy for that?
A couple questions from Ned Wall. Are you aware of any?
Oh dear. Okay, well, let me just say, even before I hear them, I figure I'm in trouble now, but go ahead.
Are you aware of any examples of quote, widespread, unquote, vote fraud this year or any year, anywhere?
No. Absolutely not. And every court that's looked at it and every journalist that's looked at it has found the same thing. I mean, you think, you've been through all this. It's been going on for months now, right? it's like it's like that old joke about, your parents used to say, finish your food. There are children in third world countries who are starving, and you'd say, name one. The question on voter fraud this year is over and over and over again has been, name one. It's not happening.
And this last question is, please comment on the Electoral College. Should we eliminate it? Is it useful in any way? Can we get that done politically?
Well, that's a two-headed question, but the answer is, I've been back and forth on that, and again, it's not an ACLU position, but I really think I've become convinced that what it does is it amplifies and exaggerates the inequity of having the five smallest states with about 5 million in population having the same or having more senators than the largest state in population, 40 million, as I recall, in California. And I just don't see how that can be allowed to continue. It just makes no sense. And so I think the answer is, I think we ought to get rid of it. I think it doesn't work anymore. How possible do I think that is? Frankly, not very right now.
Okay. Well, thank you, John, so much. This has been rich and timely. And thank you, Catherine, and the Racial Justice Initiative for bringing John to us.